This program is brought to you by thepodcastfactory.com.
How would you like to get more customers, make more profits, and have bigger breakthroughs? Get Doberman Dan's profit-boosting breakthroughs. Normally, this would cost you $98 per month, but right now, for listening to this show, he's giving you a free copy of his Doberman Dan letter. All you have to do is go to dobermandan.com and sign up to get your free copy now.
Prepare yourself for the uncensored, nothing held back, no BS reality of how business and life really work. Doberman Dan is off the chain.
Jonathan, you know that I am a medical expert, right? And
Dr. Doberman Dan.
That's right. And my credentials are that my sister's best friend graduated from medical school, OSU medical school, by the way. So just through the process of osmosis there, hanging out with her now, I've become a medical expert. So everybody should listen to everything I say about health and just do it unquestioningly, correct?
I believe you're right. It's your show. You can say what you want.
That's right. That's right. So I have an interesting show for you today. A gentleman reached out to me in response to our episode, Let's Put Ritalin in the Water Supply. Remember that one, Jonathan?
Yeah, actually, I still think about it to this day.
So a gentleman who actually is a medical expert reached out to me, and I thought it would be fun to have him on the show. So I'm happy to introduce to you Dr. Kenny Handelman. So Dr. Kenny, or should we call him Sir Kenny, because now he is a knight in the marketing Camelot, is a psychiatrist in good old Oakville, Ontario, a beautiful part of the world. If you've never visited there, I highly recommend it. One of the most beautiful areas and cleanest big cities I've ever seen. He's a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist.
Dan,
and
how does a guy like this with these credentials end up on your list?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're going to ask him that.
Good one, Jonathan. Good one.
Yeah, because I'm going to specifically ask him, what is it about me that resonates with you? Because I ain't the most erudite of persons. Learned that word in a Dan Kennedy newsletter when Dan Kennedy was making fun of me. So he's a world-renowned expert in attention deficit disorder, and he calls it something else, which is the title of his book. I'm going to let him tell you about that. But I really appreciate him being on the show. Want to introduce you to Dr. Kenny Handelman. What's up, Dr. Kenny?
Thanks so much for having me, Dan. And Jonathan.
The pleasure is all mine. The pleasure is all mine. Would you do me a favor? Tell the story of how we connected and how you eventually wound up on the show.
For sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. And I will let you know how I ended up in your, marketing Camelot world and all this. But to start off, so I work in the field of ADHD. I'm a psychiatrist. I assess kids and teens as well as adults. And I have adult ADHD myself. So, I teach other doctors about ADHD, and I've spoken in 19 countries across the world. I have a book on ADHD. I've participated in research, all this sort of stuff. So, I do like marketing stuff, and I'm online and have a podcast myself and all of these sorts of things. And so I came across your podcast, and then I think it was in February of this past year, 2016, you had an episode on Let's Put Ritalin in the Drinking Water. And I was listening to it while I was at the gym. And I was kind of cringing the whole way through, right? It was just, there are a lot of misconceptions about ADHD out there. And I felt like you guys were kind of hitting on about 95% of them. And, it kind of bothered me, but I thought, I don't need to go online and just try and flame you and just be like a troll, whatever. It's your podcast. It's your audience. You share what you want to share and everything else. And then I saw you speak at an event in June and thought you were quite good and everything. And I think it was June. And then, I got onto your list and ended up joining your marketing Camelot and appreciating learning from you and your material. And so once I joined your community, I thought, well, I'll just email you and let you know. I just took issue with some of the things and, I didn't think you were necessarily serving your community that well. with that information. So, and to your credit, you emailed me back and said, hey, well, let's bring you on the podcast because I'm sure, lots of entrepreneurs may have ADHD and maybe you can help out our community. So that's how I'm here. And I really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation that you were willing to do that.
Well, it's my pleasure. And you do realize you're living up to the stereotype of the nice, polite Canadian, because probably anybody from the U.S. would have flamed me.
Well, yes, it's true. I can't help it. Well, let me just say this. I'm sorry about that.
Nice.
I try to Americanize now and again. And, maybe when we get a little further, we can get a little heated, but we'll see.
All right, good. I'm looking forward to it. No, appreciate you being on the show. So I've got a ton of questions because I know a lot of people who have told me that they suffer from, you know what? Here's my first question. I would like you to clear up. We hear the term ADD and ADHD. So they seem to be used all the time, like interchangeably, but would you please explain the difference?
For sure. So historically, there were two terms, ADD and ADHD, and that related to how it was diagnosed. So if it was a difficulty with focus primarily, so can't stay focused, distracted, disorganized, losing things, forgetful, etc., those were the can't focus symptoms, so it was an attention deficit disorder. But if somebody had the can't focus and also hyperactivity, so restless, can't sit still, kids who climb too much, impulsive, acting without thinking, interrupting and intruding, all of these things, then they had the inattentive and the hyperactive symptoms, so it was called ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So the H was included. At this point, the official terminology is ADHD for everybody. And then you either have ADHD inattentive presentation if you just have the can't focus symptoms, or ADHD hyperactive impulsive symptoms or presentation if you only have the hyperactive impulsive symptoms, or ADHD combined if you have both. So in my, as a doctor in the field, I always call it ADHD. But a lot of people I work with will say, oh, no, I just have ADD. And I just say tomato, right? It's just the official terminology versus what people say. But the original idea is somebody with ADD doesn't have hyperactivity and somebody with ADHD does.
I see. Okay. Well, that makes sense now. I'm fascinated by something that I find very consistently in so many entrepreneurs. A bunch of entrepreneurs have been diagnosed ADHD, but yet these are some of the most successful entrepreneurs I know. So I got to thinking, is that a requirement to be a successful entrepreneur? But I'm dying to hear your take on that.
Okay, so let me just give a little background about ADHD or ADD, and it, like we just said, it doesn't matter which term I say, right? It's really the same thing. So there are a list of symptoms, and you can find them online, the diagnostic criteria, whatever. And I've already listed a few. So everybody has some of those symptoms sometimes, right? And if somebody's going through a separation or divorce, or there's a death in the family, or some kind of trauma or something, everybody has a good number of those symptoms for a little while. But when somebody has a critical number of those symptoms ongoing, for a good long time, and for adults, that's really since childhood. So there have to have been some symptoms going back into childhood. So when those symptoms are there and they're causing impairment, then somebody can be diagnosed with ADHD. So whenever anybody says, oh, it's just kids just have to be a little energetic or hyper, or somebody just has to be late once in a while and then they get diagnosed and thrown on pills, well, that's not really the case. They have to have assuming they get a good assessment, because there are doctors out there who will talk for 5 minutes and write a prescription, which I view as malpractice, right? So, but essentially, if they're assessed properly, that's what the diagnosis is. And it really can cause a lot of impairment. Now, part of what happens with ADHD, those of us with ADHD, we have really quick thinking brains and bad breaks. So our regulation system in our brain isn't quite as good as other people's with ADHD. So we think fast and we have trouble stopping ourselves. So if we're doing one thing and something distracts us, it's hard for us to ignore that other thing. If we're doing one thing and it gets a little boring because it's repetitive and we see something new and shiny and exciting, it pulls our attention and we can't stop ourselves from ignoring what we're supposed to finish and starting something new and exciting, right? So we have these fast thinking brains. Now, this can get people into a whole bunch of trouble. It's like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it could be wonderful. On the other hand, it can be terrible. So there is very good long-term research that adults with ADHD who are not diagnosed and not treated have higher rates of motor vehicle accidents, speeding tickets, things like that, higher rates of divorce, higher rates of drug and alcohol problems, higher rates of depression, anxiety, psychiatric hospitalization, more unemployment, less likely to finish education. I mean, if you go into the jails, there's good research that anywhere from 20 to 45% of people who are incarcerated have adult ADHD. So that's the bad side of it. Okay. Now then there's the good side of it. It's like a gift that's difficult to unwrap. But if you can stabilize your symptoms and tap into this fast thinking, creative, out of the box brain, you can achieve incredible things. So the people that you know who are amazing entrepreneurs doing great things, they figured out a way either with treatment or with strategies or with support around them to deal with or kind of like get somebody else to do the stuff they're really bad at, and then they work at this stuff they're incredible at. So their creativity, their presentation skills, their sales skills, their content creation, their marketing, whatever they're great at, and they maximize that. So for people to be great with ADHD, you really have to identify your strengths, focus on your strengths, and avoid the stuff that's the quicksand, right? Like, for me personally, paperwork is my kryptonite, right? Like I have adult ADHD. I was diagnosed as an adult. And honestly, like if I was late several years ago, if I was late for my taxes one more year, I was going to be in serious trouble. And so I had to get the bookkeeper, the accountant, I had to send them the stuff. And now I'm never late, right? Because when I was trying to do too much of it myself, it was a night. I was in quicksand. I couldn't get it done. And the same thing applies to all these entrepreneurs with businesses, right? So, like people like Sir Richard Branson, he has ADHD. David Neilman from JetBlue Airlines. There's a lot of really top business people, entrepreneurs who have ADHD. And like, what does Richard Branson do? I mean, he comes up with this, like, we're going to fly people commercially to outer space. And then he hires the top business people to run the company and deal with the details. And then he does amazing, exciting things like jump out of planes from high atmosphere and fly down and do a media thing, right? He's great at what he's great at, and he hires out all the rest of the stuff. So that's just a quick overview.
That's, again, I find it fascinating because I love to see, I have a couple people I'm thinking of in mind. I love to see how their minds work. But then I've also wondered, like, I don't see how they get anything done because I can't keep them on track for more than, a few seconds at a time when they're, rapid fire machine gunning out ideas is pure brilliance. But I guess you gave the secret there. They either surround themselves with support people. That's probably a biggie right there, right? The people who can focus and do the nitty gritty logistical stuff.
Well, and it's also, I mean, that applies to every business owner, right? I mean, the E-Myth and all this stuff, any entrepreneur who tries to do everything just can't grow. But the thing that's really different with ADHD, when somebody's really properly diagnosed, not this 5-minute assessment or bullcrap or people just trying to get prescriptions because they think they'll be able to stay up better or study better or stupid things like that. When there's a real diagnosis, there's brain research showing that the dopamine system, which is involved in focus, it's also involved in pleasure and interest and excitement and things like that. The dopamine system in ADHD is a little less active, which is why a lot of people with ADHD do exciting and impulsive things to get more kind of excitement and pleasure out of them, right? So hence higher rates of divorce, higher rates of speeding tickets and accidents, things like that. But when there's something that's mundane, boring, uninteresting, etc., the focus system in ADHD just shuts right off. So, for me, that would be like doing accounting. Like my brain just doesn't work. Like I have to be under serious pressure or difficulty to even get anywhere near doing it because I just can't activate my focus to do it. Where when it's something, more interesting, the dopamine system turns on and it's incredible and you can have tremendous hyperfocus. So any entrepreneur may struggle with doing accounting, but if you've got ADHD, it's like your brain system shuts off and you just can't get it done. So you have to really focus on your strengths. And then you also have to exert some discipline, right? Like how many people in the business opportunity, area, just go from one bright, shiny object to the other instead of just saying my business model is A and I'm going to stick with it long enough until it yields something instead of like, oh, there's a new product launch and I'm going to buy it, right? Because it looks really exciting and that's my real answer, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think some of the stuff applies to all entrepreneurs, but it's just that much harder with ADHD.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned the dopamine issue, and you'd also talked about people with ADHD also can sometimes have a high incidence of drug and alcohol abuse. So is that a form of self-medication? There's something wrong and they're trying to correct it themselves?
100%. when I see, older teens and young adults in my clinical practice, I see patients 4 days a week in my office. When I see people with ADHD, older teens, young adults who smoke marijuana every day, if I ask them, why are you smoking marijuana? They're not saying, oh, because it's fun. I hang out with my friends. We listen to music. We have a good time. We giggle. They say, it helps me sit still in school. It helps me develop an appetite. It calms my restlessness and my worries, and it helps me sleep. And now, of course, with all the stuff with medical marijuana going on, they say, I want medical marijuana. And I say, no, right? The reason being, and this does apply to ADHD, but for younger brains, 30 and under, the brain is still developing. The frontal lobe, the command center of the brain, is still making connections. And really, even though we all assume it's normal for people to start drinking or experiment with drugs as teenagers, it's exactly the wrong time to do it because the brain is making critical connections. It's much better to start doing that stuff when you're over 30. Not that I'm encouraging anybody to get heavily into drugs or alcohol, but it's just really bad for teens. So I don't support medical marijuana at all for, an 18-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 20-year-old. Maybe it's okay for psychiatric reasons over 30. That's a whole other debate we can leave right now. But yeah, they say they use it to help regulate. Now, the research on marijuana is it may calm your restlessness. It may help you sleep. But your actual learning, it takes away IQ points and it lowers memory. So these kids subjectively feel like they're better, but it's not really actually helping.
That's interesting. The kids who say that, not just kids, but anybody who's using marijuana who says that, they use it for all those reasons you just stated. When they talk about, it helps me calm down, are they trying to silence that never-ending voice in the head, the constant barrage of thoughts? Is that part of it?
It is. I mean, ADHD, so it is that for sure. And it's the constant, I'm thinking of 27 things instead of one. Right? So that's part of it. There's also the physical restlessness if they've got hyperactivity or impulsivity. For teenagers who may have social problems, which is very common with ADHD, trouble making friends, keeping friends, if they always impulsively say stupid things socially, they're embarrassed, they get teased. If they're high, number one, they're less likely to say impulsive social things that are embarrassing. Or number two, if they do, it's hilarious because everybody's high and they think it's the drugs, right? So it helps them socially. It helps them in a whole range of things. The other thing is when ADHD is properly diagnosed, the research is 4 out of 5 people with ADHD have at least one other coexisting condition. In adults, the most common, about 49% of adults with ADHD have an anxiety disorder, and most commonly it's social anxiety disorder. So feeling very self-conscious, shy, feel like you're being judged, can't do presentations, much more than I get a little nervous before I have to do a presentation, more like I have to avoid everything and I don't want to be seen in public at a mall and, all of these sorts of things. So substance use helps that a lot, right? People go to a party, they drink 2-3 beers, realize I'm not so nervous anymore. And that's how they start getting hooked in, right? So substance use is for sure tied into self-medication.
So when you diagnose someone with ADHD,
yeah,
what's the next step from there? I mean, what do you look at? What's the treatment plan? What's the prognosis? All that stuff.
Right. So when somebody gets a diagnosis, first of all, I think it's critically important they have the right mindset, right? Because you go online and you read about ADHD and it's just all terrible stuff, right? And frankly, the New York Times is one of the worst. They've got a reporter who's got it in for ADHD and just publishes misconceptions and things like that. And you quoted the New York Times in your podcast episode, right? And, you're not supposed to know the New York Times are being idiots on this topic, right? You quoted the New York Times, right?
Well, I should know better, man. All the mainstream media is not, they don't report the news. It's
fair
just,
enough.
It's just entertainment to try to attract more eyeballs. It has nothing to do with the truth. I should have known better.
See, that's what you get for trusting the media. So this interview is going into overtime. We're going to pick it back up on next week's show. In the meantime, Dr. Kenny wants you to know that he put a resource together for you. If you're dealing with ADHD and you need more focus, go to drkenny.com/business for the resource he's put together for you. We'll see you on next week's show. Thanks for listening, and remember, if you want to create rivers of revenue from your existing customers, then the next thing you need to do is go to dobermandan.com. He's giving away a free copy of his $98 per month Doberman Dan letter just for listening to the show. Go to DobermanDan.com now and sign up for your free issue.
This is the podcastfactory.com.